Star Wars has a long and storied history in video games that stretches back for over 40 years, and while there have been many beloved and popular titles in that time, there have also been a few colossal failures and some of the biggest controversies in gaming history. Hi, I'm James from Fandom, and together, let's take a journey through the history of Star Wars video games. Everything begins in 1978 with an unlicensed, unofficial Star Wars game on cassette tape for the Apple II computer. The first officially licensed game wouldn't arrive until a year later, and was a standalone electronic command game from Kenner that was advertised as the most exciting computer game you will ever play. Then the first release for a home console computer was the Atari 2600 game The Empire Strikes Back in 1982. The game took place during the Battle of Hoth and was praised for its zingy graphics by some critics. However, Video Review magazine were less impressed, calling it the latest icon of the imbecile industry and a shamelessly exploitative little toy. Despite this scathing review, the floodgates for Star Wars games were now open, and over the next few years we got many new releases, including the now legendary Star Wars arcade game that became one of the best-selling games of 1983 with a whopping total of 12,695 units sold. That year also saw the release of Jedi Arena, the first game to feature lightsabers, and Return of the Jedi Death Star Battle. In 1984, Atari released their own version of Return of the Jedi, and then in 1985 they followed this up with their own take on The Empire Strikes Back, because releasing the games in the same order as the films would just be too simple. Interestingly, The Empire Strikes Back used the same vector graphics as the original arcade game, and was sold to arcade operators as a conversion kit. However, the original game was so good, many of them chose never to change it. Following this, there is a sizable gap in new releases as a result of the video game crash of 1983 that temporarily killed the home console market. We did get a couple of ports for the arcade game and a Japan-only release from Namco, but the only other new game for half a decade was Star Wars Droids in 1988. Eventually, in 1991, things begin to pick back up, with Attack on the Death Star and Star Wars for the NES, which was quickly followed by the Super NES version Super Star Wars in 1992, which featured a mix of run-and-gun gameplay, driving and flying. The same year, the NES also got an Empire Strikes Back game, which was again followed by the Super NES version Super Empire Strikes Back in 1993, as well as Star Wars Chess. The Super NES trilogy was eventually finished in 1994 with Super Return of the Jedi, but let's just roll back the clock for a moment, as in the early 80s, George Lucas decided to invest in video games directly rather than just franchising out the Star Wars brand to third parties, and an early version of what would become LucasArts was established. However, for the first few years of the company's existence, they didn't have the license to use Star Wars, so instead they developed various original adventure and simulation games. But in 1993, they regained the rights and released X-Wing, one of the most beloved and timeless games of all time. As their first self-published Star Wars game, they couldn't have asked for a bigger hit. Commercially, it was a bestseller, with over 100,000 copies selling on its debut weekend, and shipping a further 500,000 by Christmas. It was also critically acclaimed, winning numerous awards that year, and even today it still finds itself topping the lists of the best computer games of all time. However, LucasArts were not slowing down, as just a few months later they followed up with Rebel Assault, another major hit that has reportedly sold 1.5 million copies over its lifetime. Now we get back to 1994, where, as I mentioned, the last franchised game for this era was released. However, LucasArts were now in full swing and followed up their success from X-Wing with the sequel TIE Fighter, which again picked up plenty of awards and was praised by critics. In 1995, a Rebel Assault sequel called The Hidden Empire was released, along with Dark Forces, a first-person shooter that was later ported to the newly released PlayStation. This was the first game in the Jedi Knight series, and introduced us to Kyle Katarn, who would later appear in multiple games, novels and comics. Kyle is a former Imperial stormtrooper who defects and joins the rebellion, a plot that very likely inspired the story of Finn in the new movies. In 1996 we got just one new game, Shadows of the Empire for the Nintendo 64, that was part of a multimedia project that included games, books, comics, model kits, memorabilia and more. Essentially everything but an actual new movie. 1997 brought with it many new games, including sequels X-Wing vs TIE Fighter and Dark Forces 2. However, LucasArts also tried their hand at some new genres, branching out into fighting games with Masters of Terras Kasi and the procedurally generated adventure game Yoda Stories. 1998 was another big year with 5 new releases, including Trilogy Arcade, Rebellion, the Millennium Falcon CD-ROM playset, and Behind the Magic, which was essentially an encyclopedia that contained some trivia games and an area where you could test weapons on a stormtrooper. However, the final game from this year was the excellent Rogue Squadron for PC and N64, which sold over 1 million copies in its first year and spawned sequels, which we will come to later. For now though, it's 1999 and Star Wars is making its return to the big screen with Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, and LucasArts was making sure it had plenty of games to release alongside it. They opened up with a double feature, releasing both a direct movie adaptation for PC and PlayStation, as well as Episode 1 Racer for PC, N64 and later Game Boy Color. Racer in particular is a fondly remembered game for many fans, but 1999 also saw the release of X-Wing Alliance, the final game in the X-Wing series, as well as the edutainment game DroidWorks. In the year 2000, a new trio of Episode 1 games were released, including Jedi Power Battles for PlayStation, Battle for Naboo for N64, and Obi-Wan's Adventures for Game Boy Color. An arcade version of Racer was also released this year, with a fantastic cabinet that was modelled to resemble the cockpit of Anakin's pod racer, complete with 2 handheld throttles as controls. The year 2000 also brought us Force Commander, another real-time strategy game for PC, and Demolition for PlayStation and Dreamcast, both of which received mixed reviews at best. In 2001 we got Galactic Battlegrounds, another real-time strategy game, however this one was developed in collaboration with the creators of the hugely popular Age of Empire games, and was built using the same engine. We also got Super Bombard Racing, and the rather dreadful game for the original Xbox, Obi-Wan. However, in better news, we also got a sequel to Rogue Squadron, which became LucasArts' best-selling game at the time. This year also saw a guest appearance from Darth Maul in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3, and the release of the first Starfighter game, with its sequel Jedi Starfighter following the next year. However, 2002 was also the year Attack of the Clones hit cinemas, and the movie adaptation games returned in full force, with the Clone Wars for the 3 major home consoles, as well as the New Droid Army and Attack of the Clones for Game Boy Advanced, the latter of which received abysmal reviews, with Game Informer giving it a 1 out of 10 and calling it the dark side of gaming. However, in much better news, this year also saw the release of a new Jedi Knight game, titled Jedi Outcast, which remains one of the best reviewed Star Wars games of all time, and gave players the first chance to experience advanced lightsaber duels. And finally, a sequel to Racer was also released this year, along with Bounty Hunter, which served as a prequel to the new movie, and expanded on the story of Jango Fett, who also turned up as an unlockable character in Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. 2003 was easily one of the best years in Star Wars video game history, as not only did we get the incredible Knights of the Old Republic, which still holds up today as one of BioWare's best games, but we also got the final Jedi Knight game, Jedi Academy, a game adored by anyone who loves lightsaber combat. However, the games didn't stop there, as the final Rogue Squadron game was also released alongside Star Wars Galaxies, the first MMORPG for the franchise. However, not everything was sunshine and rainbows, as we also got Flight of the Falcon for Game Boy Advanced, which currently sits at a dismal 39 out of 100 on Metacritic. In late 2004, we got a swift follow-up to Knights of the Old Republic with the release of the sequel, The Sith Lords. However, because of the developers' high ambitions and being forced by LucasArts to finish the game so quickly, it ended up being released in what the lead designer described as an unfinished state. We also got Apprentice of the Force for the Game Boy Advanced. However, the most important game this year was undoubtedly the first Star Wars Battlefront, which was followed a year later by Battlefront 2, which fixed many of the issues with the original and was praised by critics for its improved AI, varied objectives, and the single-player campaign. 2005 was also the year of the final movie from the prequel trilogy, Revenge of the Sith. But unlike the previous movies, where we got numerous video game adaptations for different consoles, Revenge of the Sith only spawned one. There was also a massive number of mobile releases this year, as well as Republic Commando, a first-person shooter set during the Clone Wars. 2005 was also the year of the first Star Wars LEGO game, which was followed up by a sequel in 2006, both of which sold incredibly well and were praised by critics and fans alike for this new portrayal of the films and the characters. 2006 also saw the release of the RTS game Empire at War and Lethal Alliance for the PSP and DS. 2007 was somewhat of a quiet year, with little more than a couple compilation packs of previous games released, as well as Renegade Squadron for the PSP. However, in 2008, things began to pick back up, as along with the release of the Clone Wars TV series, we also got 2 new games, Lightsaber Duels for the Wii and Jedi Alliance for the DS. This was also the beginning of another multimedia project, this time called The Force Unleashed, which included a game with the same name that became the fastest selling Star Wars game of all time and won the Writers Guild of America award for the best video game writing. 2009 gave us the portable Battlefront game Elite Squadron and another entry into the Clone Wars series. In 2010 we got Clone Wars Adventures, a virtual world game where you could create a custom avatar and unlock things like new weapons, outfits and ships. However, many premium items were reserved only for real money microtransactions. We also got a sequel to The Force Unleashed, however, it underperformed compared to most expectations and was far more harshly received by critics than the original. In 2011, a new MMORPG was released, Star Wars The Old Republic, and although no official value has ever been disclosed, it is believed to have been one of the most expensive games in history to produce. We also got a new LEGO Star Wars game this year based on the Clone Wars. In early 2012, we got Kinect Star Wars, and later that year, Star Wars 1313 was announced at E3. However, it was only a few months later that Lucasfilms began to be acquired by Disney, and it was eventually announced that 1313 had been cancelled and that LucasArts would stop making and publishing games indefinitely. Then in 2013, Disney announced a new exclusive deal with EA to make new Star Wars games for console and PC. For a while, everything went dark, and outside of a selection of mobile and pinball games, Angry Birds spin-offs, and some expansions to the Old Republic, we didn't get anything new until 2015's reboot of Star Wars Battlefront. Unfortunately, the game was rushed to market to coincide with the release of the new Star Wars movie The Force Awakens, and as a result, the single-player part of the game was axed. This was heavily criticised by fans, including John Boyega, who played Finn in the movie. In 2016, the LEGO version of The Force Awakens was released, to mainly positive reviews from both fans and critics, making the LEGO games one of the most consistent runs within the franchise. In 2017, EA returned with Battlefront 2, now with a story mode and many other improvements over the previous game. EA wanted to make sure that everyone knew the game was going to make up for the original, even going as far as to bringing in the previously critical Boyega to do some promotional material. However, even before the game's release, alarm bells started ringing about the presence of pay-to-win microtransactions in the game, and during an early access preview a few days before the game's release, players had their fears confirmed as they discovered the game was filled with purchasable loot boxes, which contained items that offered a real gameplay advantage. Then things got worse as players calculated it would take roughly 40 hours to grind out enough in-game currency to unlock characters like Darth Vader or Luke Skywalker, unless you spent real-world cash on the loot boxes. In response to this, EA made a now notorious post on the topic, which became the single most downvoted comment in Reddit history. Eventually, EA reduced the cost of the characters and removed the microtransactions. However, unfortunately, the loot box system was so baked into the game's design, it required a complete overhaul for the progression and economy that wouldn't be completed until March of 2018. However, the fallout from Battlefront 2's loot box scandal continues to this day, as lawmakers around the world look into the legal ramifications of loot boxes in video games and whether they constitute as gambling, leading to some countries even declaring them illegal. Then in 2019, it was announced that a single-player Star Wars game that had been in development was cancelled. It had previously been in the works at Visceral Games. However, after EA closed the studio and then tried to change the direction of the game, everything apparently fell apart and it was scrapped. However, two upcoming games are still in development, the first being a new LEGO Star Wars game called The Skywalker Saga, which will span all 9 movies, and the second being the next game from EA, Jedi Fallen Order. Fallen Order is being developed by Respawn Entertainment, the creators of the Titanfall games and Apex Legends, and is currently slated to release on the 15th of November 2019. However, the big question is, will this be EA's Star Wars Redemption or the final nail in the coffin? Let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I've been James for Fandom. Thank you for watching and enjoy the game.
No, we are not doing that again.